and welcome to the annual meeting of the St. Thomas Historical Trust. Thank you for being here in person and joining us via Zoom. I am Luana Wheatley, President of the Trust. Before we hear from our guest speaker, I'd like to briefly discuss some of the achievements over the past year, some new initiatives, and how you can help us moving forward. Hassel Island, on Hassel Island, we completed repairs of the Midden Dock, which made docking for tours a lot easier. We are in the process of shoring up the Garrison House. Hassel Island resident Jeff Pickett has been generous in donating manpower to help us clear all the trails and keep them clear. And he will extend that to the National Park Service side once we get that agreement fully executed. And speaking of that agreement, we renewed our partnership with the National Park. And as they would admit, and we would all admit, the bureaucracy of working with the National Park does make it a slow process, but we are back in conversation. So I'm really hoping that we will be able to tour the entire Hassel Island in the near future. The DPNR side of Hassel Island is available for tours by appointment. And so we're very excited to get those tours up and running again. Yeah. License plates sales continue to be a steady stream of income for us. Thank you, Jessica, for taking on that project. Our financial report for fiscal year 2021 is available on our website, and we're managing, as Charles so eloquently put it. In 2021, we did a caning class, which was a super successful caning class. And out of that class, we were able to train 2 people who can actually repair cane chairs, not with that sheet that you buy, but actually do the process of recaning it. So it was very successful. Thanks to Pam for spearheading that project. And as a result of that class, we were able to be included in a documentary called Yes, We Came. So it was very, I look forward to doing more of those in the near future. Some of our new initiatives include establishing QR codes for some of our sites downtown Charlotte and on Hassel Island and in the museum. There's a team working off that grant to ensure that, people can take self-guided tours without always having to have a tour guide, and we are able to monetize the QR code. So it is also becomes a fundraising effort for us. We recently were awarded a grant from CFDI for a basket weaving workshop. So we're looking forward to moving forward with those kinds of hands-on kind of cottage industry endeavors. So the dates are pending for that, but we look forward to that happening later on this year. I'm just gonna turn it over really quick to Mr. Felipe Ayala, who has will discuss another new and very exciting initiative that we're gonna have moving forward.
Thanks, Paul. No stranger to the trust and no stranger to projects with the trust. I'm excited to let you know that we were offered an opportunity with the Government Employees Retirement System to create a museum structure at the West Indian Company dock. Jessica Geller has brought me into the 20th century in terms of helping with PowerPoint presentations and just making what we're planning to do more interactive. As we realized, Felipe likes pretty furniture, he likes just pictures on walls and walking around and smiling and seeing all of that. But what we realized that as the world changes and as the trust moves into the next century, and it's a segue into our presentation coming ahead, that we have to make our product more interactive. That's one of the things that working with a new trust star, Ladine, who has helped us bring a lot of excitement and a lot of energy to this project, always with the support of the board. offering to use the Waco main office, the historic building, as a small community center on the dock, showcasing the very best of St. Thomas's history as Waco connects itself to our historic harbor. One of the things Nadine shared with us is that, and Jessica echoed this sentiment from day one, is that it has to be interactive. It has to tell the story without docents. It has to be able to spring forth and come to life. This is where museums are today. And that has been a big learning curve for our hero. I had to really think about this as we lead the Trust's education department into producing the very best of this. We're looking at taking a lot of our existing inventory and splitting it between there with new things added, but also telling the stories not only of the history of the harbor, but also from day one, from the original people that came here, how they migrated, how we got to where we are architecturally. All of these stories come to life in a very small space. And it's exciting to know the possibilities. Nadine shared with us, well, what we're embarking on is not just about a museum, but about a town center. It's about reimagining a town center. As we maintain our offices here, we also have the opportunity to capture new guests to our town and guests that stay in hotels to be able to experience the magic. Think about an amphitheater, think about that basket weaving class or quadrille or hair tie, all of these different things that we can do at the dock. So we're very excited about that. On June 10th, we present formally to the GRS board. And I kind of believe it's a godsend that every time we were supposed to present, something happened. And something happened with them, not really with us, we were prepared. But I think it was just every time this sort of hiccup happens, it allows us to do more with the presentation, especially introducing us to Nadine. It's definitely just been a burst of wonderful energy. Anyway, thank you so much. We look forward to a lot of wonderful things. And to segue into what David, our guest speaker, is going to talk about, how we update our trust, how we bring our trust into the next century, how do we make it all interactive. Stay tuned.
Thank you, Felipe. And I want to say that sounds like it is going to be such an exciting project.
It is.
I am super excited, not only because I'm the president of the trust, but because my full-time job is at the Department of Tourism. So I'm extremely excited about having that as a part of our product offering. I want to say thank you to all our board members. This is my first foray and they've been super supportive. And so I want to say thank you for all that you do, for all the spearheading of the projects that you take on. I mean, it's very exciting. There has its moments, you know, but there's some moments. But, you know, I'm excited. I'm excited to take it on and, you know, I do as much as I can in the time that I have. I want to end by saying that, you know, the trust is only as good as the members that you contribute to it. You know, how you can help is by volunteering your time at the museum. You know, you can serve as a tour guide and we can train you for both downtown Charlotte Amalia and Asset Island. Submit articles to our newsletter. If you have the grant writing skill set, that could be great. We have empty seats on our board if you care to be a board member. Join a committee, assist with fundraising, anything that you could do to help us, especially since we are a nonprofit. And I know there are a lot of nonprofits out there, you know, looking for people, but you know, if you have a commitment to cultural preservation and historic preservation, you know, I encourage everybody to contribute something to the St. Thomas Historical Trust. And I take this time now to introduce our guest speaker, Mr. David Knight, locally based cultural resource consultant, historian, and author. He was appointed to the St. Thomas St. John Committee of Historic Preservation by Governor DeYoung in 2013 and named to the Presidential Advisory Council of the University of the Virgin Islands in 2016. Mr. Knight currently serves as the Territory State Chairman of the Virgin Islands Historic Preservation Commission. His presentation today will be on the fundamentals for reshaping the colonial narrative in the Virgin Islands. And we are very happy to have Mr. Knight here with us to make this presentation at our annual meeting. Mr. Knight.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Whitley. Thank you all for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm so encouraged to hear new good things happening for the trust. One of the things I've been most concerned with over the last few years with the disruptions we've been experiencing is that many of our nonprofit preservation organizations throughout the territory have struggled and haven't really been as dynamic as they've been in the past. And just in the same way that I'm concerned that all our young people have missed so much school over these disruptions, and we have a few years now that's going to be an educational gap that we're going to have to try to make up somehow. That we have the same situation going on within our preservation community within the Virgin Islands. We've lost our momentum. For so many years, the Trust was so active. Presentations, the St. John Historical Society was active. Presentations, hikes, newsletters. St. Croix Landmark, the same thing, very active and vital. And we all built off of that knowledge and those activities, and we developed a community of history and preservation-minded people that were pretty well educated. And there were events that people could come out to, everybody learned. I know that I was on the board of the St. John Historical Society for 12 years before I was appointed to the Virgin Islands Historic Preservation Commission. And during that time, I gave lectures and talks to the organization almost on a monthly basis. If I wasn't leading a hike or doing a presentation, I was writing for the newsletter, things like that. And over the years, as the membership expanded, we started to have a really well-informed, interesting group of people that could talk about some of the more sophisticated and nuanced things about history. And as you learn more, you then develop this thirst to know more. But lately, I am concerned that we've slid backwards in our community as far as foundations for historical knowledge. I made a few notes for myself. I'll try not to read, but I just do have to look at. One of the things that concerns me a lot is particularly some of the younger people. I've had two questions posed to me recently by some younger community members. One was a young man who I really would have expected to have a little more foundation in history asked me, so senior, most kids call me senior, were there really windmills in the Virgin Islands? With those stone towers, were those really windmills? And I was like, wow. Okay. And the other one was, I heard somebody question how a state tutu in the Tutu Valley got its name and asked if it was named after Bishop Desmond Tutu. I'm sorry, but I think we're in trouble here, And then I also am a bit concerned how I've been hearing a lot of talk about reimagining history, because we all understand that we need to work on our new narrative and our new perspectives. Okay? But, well, as Felipe said, in struggling for how we're going to present these new ideas and so on, We have to add technology and make it vital. I agree, and we need to do that. But we also can't lose track of the fundamental, foundational facts of history at the same time, you know. And we need to make sure that that those things remain. That we can build our narrative. We need to adjust it, but we have to accept and understand the foundational facts of history. Anyway, those two comments, those two questions, sent me to kind of some introspection and thinking, and it made me wonder about this idea of reimagining history. Because I believe what we need to do is we need to rethink our narrative. We need to readjust our perspectives. But I worry about the idea of reimagining history, because imagination is not necessarily based on facts. No, it's a makeup. And you know, and that made me think, though. I posed a question, and the way I've arranged my presentation talk with you all today is I really want to have more of a discussion. I'm not really here to talk to you, but I'd like to hear what other people think as well. So one of the first things that it led me to think about was, well, haven't we always kind of been reimagining and imagining our histories? I'll give you an example. We talk about geographical reference here in our town, in the cultural landscape. We talk about Bluebeard's Castle and Blackbeard's Castle. Well, aren't those imaginings?
Iris.
Because those places aren't those places, you know, and this is an imagined history, kind of a cultural history. And you know, we're not the first generation who's kind of embellished our stories for the sake of tourism and creating a good story. I personally think real history is the best story of all, you know. But so, yeah, so maybe we've always kind of had to balance this idea of reimagining the past. You know, and then in that same vein, I thought about in the late 1800s, Felipe, you can correct me if I'm wrong, 1870s, 80s, when the new facade was put on Fort Christian with the clock tower and all the like medieval castle looking, you know.
Gothic revival.
Yeah, Gothic revival, but isn't that just kind of a fantasy reimagining of something?
Of Christian the Ninth.
Yeah, okay. And then other people built towers to kind of mimic our towers. You know, the Hamburg American Line building with their tower added another tower to our landscape. And of course, there's all kinds of stories and questions now about that building. Tower. Real history is great. And then, of course, Fairchild built us a fantasy Moorish tower up on the top of the hill. So a castle, yeah, another castle. And then I wonder sometime, and I hope no one takes offense to this, because our town, it is wonderful to see our town revitalized to the degree, cleaned up the way it's been. But isn't it really a reimagining? I mean, I don't think the town ever actually had cobblestone streets, and palm line avenues, you know. So how do we balance, you know, this need for keeping our foundations grounded in fact, and still, you know, are free to imagine ourselves and our future, see ourselves in the landscape. And I would just say this, I wrote this thought down, that as the current and future generations grapple with reimagining the past, let us hope that they do so with well-informed and deliberative minds and kindly hearts. That their imaginings are well supported and grounded in foundational truths of common human history. That they judge and assess past actions, no matter how bitter or distasteful, not in the blistering light of present popular culture, but in the appropriate context within the ever unraveling distance of time. We need new narratives. And I myself have been struggling. I've been studying history deeply for 30 some or more years. And I've focused most of my work on primary resources, archival work. And even now, I go back and I read introductions to my standard narratives of the background history of St. Thomas or the Virgin Islands, and I kind of get a little knee-jerk because, maybe I don't really look at things quite that same way. And so I've been taking the time in this period of disruption that we've been going through. And I've been doing a lot of reassessing myself. And during this period, I've been going back, I realized that I keep repeating kind of like a boilerplate narrative of Virgin Islands history. Because when you begin studying history, you're very into it, and but you set these foundations in that foundational narrative. And I realized that largely, particularly for us at St. Thomas and Jack, that we've pretty much been accepting a Danish narrative of our history. Most of the books that have been, foundational to our knowledge and learning, and and that more contemporary books that research was based on, pretty much have all been produced by Danes. We read Westergaard being one of the primary ones, and his work has been foundational for our narrative. And I think we need to rethink that. Felipe touched on it when he said that when we look at how we talk about the history of our island, we need to go all the way back. We have not been properly inclusive to the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean. Not just for us, virtually most scholarship that was done during the 20th century did not treat that with the weight that it needs to be considered. And there's so much to talk about here, but it has sent me back on a journey of discovery over the last few years to really start to look at these foundations of where we started history and what really went on. And of course, I think it's interesting to note here also that the Danes don't touch it, really, I think one of the only, George Hoist, who was one of the early governors after the transfer of the colony to the crown in the 1750s, in his narrative that he wrote on the history of St. Thomas, he writes that when the first Danish governor arrived, Eric Schmidt, that he arrived on St. Thomas. St. Thomas was inhabited by Hollanders and Caribs. That's really about it. I mean, we don't have any indication of where these people came from. But I think that for us, other islands in other parts of the Caribbean, and certainly now in the United States, particularly in New England, people are much more focused and have always had that contact period and that indigenous period on their radars. But because of we got so much of our early narrative from the Danes, who didn't arrive until the mid-1600s, really, and didn't start to kind of shape our historical context until after 1671, and really not until 1755, when it actually Virgin Islands became the crown Danish colony. They arrived so late that they never had to deal with an indigenous presence. There was no contact between Danes or struggle over land between Danes and native people in the Virgin Islands. So it's not part of their colonial history whatsoever. So it's really not odd that they didn't mention it. But to kind of put things in context and how much history we're missing out here, I made this little donut chart right here. Okay? That blue represents the approximate length of time that the archaeologists tell us that they can document human presence in the Caribbean. That's like 7,000 years. Okay, these little slivers up here, that's the Spanish and the Iberian people, you know, the Spanish and Portuguese. From the time of their documented historic first contact with people in the Caribbean, they basically dominated European influence and impact to the region pretty much on their own for about 150 years. So they met a culture that had been in existence and in this place for 7,000 years. Their direct impact on it was 156 years before other Europeans, and now we're speaking about the Virgin Islands specifically, before other European, they would call them interlopers, you know, started to come in and try to get inroads into influence. And after the Spanish kind of backed off on the Virgin Islands and kind of allowed things to happen, we have the French and the Dutch and some Anglophone, and we have to be careful about, you know, English. It wasn't just English. We have Irish, we have Scottish. You know, we even have Courlanders, you know, people that later became Polish, you know, and Swedes and Norwegians in there. So there's a period between the Spanish period when this group of European interlopers arrived, and of course we have enslaved Africans arriving with the Spanish, and we have increasing numbers of Africans arriving with this interloper group, although many of them themselves were brought originally as indentured people by the European country. So they kind of held sway, that group, and I include the Danish West Indian Company, Schmidt and Iverson, in that group, because I'll get back to this in a second. But we think of the beginning of the Danish period with the arrival of Schmidt and Iverson. The truth is that the Danes were very, very minor part of that population group. They already met established people here in St. Thomas, and those people could not live. And more people came and sought Danish neutrality in that colony from disparate places. So we have a period then of about 170 years. Then the Danish crown really takes over and becomes the dominant government and entity controller of the Virgin Islands from 1755, 1754, 1755. And the Danes had the islands here for 162 years. And then now we've been 105 years since the American United States presence. But put all that together, and you've got a period of 530 years of non-Indigenous intervention in the Virgin Islands against 7,000 years. How is it that we can minimize the presence and the contributions to the development and creations of our landscapes and our infrastructure? How can we diminish, to maybe a quick word or reference in history, of people whose cultures were in this house for 7,000 years? And one of the things that I think we miss, last year I had an interesting contract. I worked for a year on the Raccoon Hill Road expansion and road project. And we got into phase 3 historical background on that project, which is the highest level of historic investigation we can. So I got really in depth in looking at the area between from Sugar Estate all the way up through Raccoon Hill, the Raccoon Estate. And one of the images that I came across during that project was this wonderful little image here. This is not that old, this is like 1850s, but that's the Raccoon Hill Road. It's going right up over Raccoon Hill, looking back across at Charlotte Harbor.
What year is that?
This was done by a Moravian missionary named, I think it's Theodore Raquel. And he did a series. He traveled through the Caribbean and did paintings of all the Moravian missions and so on in 1860s. Okay, and then you wonder why did you do a painting of Raccoon Hill? Well, the Moravians had owned the estate Raccoon. They called it Estate Bethel, and were the ones responsible for developing it as a plantation. The sugar mill tower that's at the top of Raccoon Hill was built by the Moravians. So there was some Moravian history associated. They didn't still own the property at this time, but I believe that's why. But to get back to where we were talking about Indigenous presence, that road right there, the Raccoon Hill Road. While I was doing my work on that project, at the same time, that project had forced me to go back and kind of relook at my standard boilerplate for Indigenous presence. And I came across a couple of quotes that I use in the report that I think are significant here. And one is, I quote an individual named Herbert Reinhold Jackson. I really don't know who he is, but it's a wonderful quote. He says, "Man has traveled the face of the earth throughout untold millennia. And in so doing, he has used that which he first of all things created, for in the beginning there was the word." People traveled this island for 7,000 years. They made paths. And one of the things that we miss is that we have this wonderful archaeological investigation that went on here in town down at the conference center. Found this abundant Taino Native American site. And we had this wonderful, abundant Taino and earlier indigenous priests around, even up the Crucial site in the middle of the Tutu Valley. And what connects those two sites? I mean, those people didn't live and fish and survive on the shores of Shalom Harbor and be unaware of their people, their friends, their family, their relatives, all working the agricultural land along the stream bed and the lush interior of the island. You know, you have your fishermen and you have your traders and your canoe makers over here, and you've got your farmers and up there. And that road connects those two sites. Exactly. How old is that road? And I found in going into the earliest Danish West Indian County records, references to that road existing in the first earliest colonial records. That road has shaped our landscape in that when the Dutch and Danes and Anglophone settlers that were here first started dividing up the landscape, they used that road as a geographical context for laying out the plantations. And if you go into the earliest tax rolls and records for the very first land grants, which were given by Governor Iverson, and formalized by him when he left 1678, the last act he did was formalize land grants. He said, I'm going to now officially give out these pieces of land to the people who deserve them so that nobody can complain about me, right? And in his descriptions, those properties are laid out going down the new border, down that valley, to the north of the path and to the south of the path. From the north of the path to the top of the highest hill, to the south of the path. And that path, of course, follows that water course that starts at the base of Flag Mountain on the, up the hill above Frenchman's Bay. Flag Hill.
Right, Frenchman's Bay up there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
starts up there, and that water course comes down. Of course, there's many tributaries that come down as it goes, meanders down through what we call Tutu Valley today. Okay, but basically that path follows that water course, wiggles around down there by Fort Milner, goes around that hump, and it continues down Serpentine Run, right out to the lagoon and all those resources in the lagoon, the clams, the oysters, the fish, all that stuff, And I believe that it's pretty clear that water course was probably navigable by small canoe all the way up to at least by Rodriguez Auto Parts.
Well, David, I would say that we'll go a little further back to where the Hartman property is. This is a bigger pond in there too.
Yep. But there's also some created reservoirs. And this is another thing. Thank you for that.
Even by Costulas, there's so many lagoons with water lilies.
Yeah. Well, that's why that's our fertile valley for this island. And that's why the Tutu archaeological dig and that Indian presence is
because they had water there.
Yeah, well, they had water.
They didn't have to go down to the ocean.
They had water, but the water and the trail, those are the roads, the paths to the resources, right? And I know they were digging a drainage culvert there across the street from like Kentucky Fried Chicken and the entrance to Times Square to the Rodriguez property some years back. And I remember when they dug in there were huge piles of clamshells,
Oh, wow.
right? And so anyway, but to what Felipe just reminded me of, ponds. This is another thing the indigenous people would have created. They would have dammed rivers. Okay. They would have dammed the watercourses to preserve and make ponds. 7,000 years of presence and development, you're gonna do stuff. You're gonna leave an imprint on the land. Okay, they didn't make metal. Okay, the early group, for about the first 3,500 years of that, we're dealing with more or less a Stone Age type of people. Okay, foragers, hunter-gatherers with stone tools. Okay, that are practicing maybe a little bit of agriculture, maybe a little bit of animal husbandry, but basically they're going out and foraging. But for the second 3,500 years of that, that's when we see the rise of our ceramic cultures. And people are making tools, they're making implants, they are impacting the land, they are starting to practice agriculture. They're building pens for animals, traps. They're learning how to use weirs for catching fish and crayfish and stuff in rivers. They're the masters of their land, you know? That's a lot of time. It's a lot of time. And we just turn a blind eye to the impacts of that. We don't know really to what degree. We don't seem to separate what we consider to be the natural landscape from a manipulated landscape, a landscape that had had people on it for thousands of years. There's no such thing as like a virgin landscape when you think about it that way, especially on our small islands.
So why hasn't there been any discussion about it, like in-depth discussion about it?
Well, for the same reason we really haven't talked about African slavery in who wrote the books, who's been teaching us our history, okay? And it's really it. The other thing that, I'm gonna digress just for a second. And guys, excuse me, because I tend to, once I get going, I can just talk.
That's
So,
great.
Very interesting.
you know, use hand signals, you know, like keep it moving or, you know, okay. So otherwise I'll just keep going. But I'm gonna digress for a second because in all this period now that I've been going through, you know, we've all had a lot of time to think, locked up in our households, isolating and so on, you know. I've been spending more and more time lately in New England. My partner Lolly always wanted to have a little house in Maine years ago. We were both boat people. She sailed, she'd taken a boat and had gone up to Maine, fell in love with it. And when our kids were younger, both our sons went to college in the States, and we ended up buying a little place in Maine to be close to the kids while they went to school. And I was really surprised because my name is David Whitney Knight, and I had no idea that I had history in Maine, family history going back, you know. But all of a sudden, there's all these Knights and Whitneys everywhere around here. I went down to I had to get a small procedure down to the hospital. I went to the hospital, and the lady asked me my name. I said, David Knight. And she said, oh, which David Knight are you? And I just kind of chuckled. And I said, well, how many could there be? And she turned the computer screen, and there was two pages of David Knights. Yeah. And David is a reoccurring. I'm the fifth David Knight in my direct line. David Whitney Knight, and there's Whitney's on this. Anyway, okay. So this sent me into being really kind of interested in my New England background heritage, and I got my DNA done recently, and turns out, yep, I'm white. You know, no matter how much I was hoping, imagining for some, maybe a little bit of diversity. Thank goodness to have Priscilla in my family. That's just some diversity. Anyway, in learning and deep diving into my New England, and because my family apparently goes way back, New England, the earliest settlements in New England, married into Mayflower people. I developed the family line, and I was really relieved. It's something, of course, that we would always think about here. I found no slave owners, no one engaged in it. Basically, dirt farmers, carpenters, you know, but New England, solid New England folk. And that was, I must say, a relief for me. I felt good about that. But then I started to find out what my people did to the Indians when they arrived, the native people. And it turns out that my earliest immigrant ancestor, who came over from England and landed in the area what is now between New Hampshire and Maine, got his land grant by virtue of the fact that he fought in King Philip's War. Now, most of us don't know, I certainly didn't know much about New England history. I figured King Philip was some English king or something. King Philip was actually an Indian chief. And there's a series of early colonial wars that went on to eradicate and push back the indigenous people out of the territories around New England. My family particularly ended up in the Connecticut River Valley, and that is where the Pequot people were. And Pequots were one of the indigenous groups in New England that resisted, and that they particularly brutalized and drove them out. And I was, wait for it, here it comes, we're coming back to the Virgin Islands, okay? It was interesting for me to find out that during that period, from late 1500s and early mid 1600s, that one of the strategies that the settlers in New England had in dealing with captive Indians was to sell them into slavery in the West Indies, particularly the Pequot of the Connecticut River Valley, where my people were. And of course, the thinking was, this is a vast continent. If you can go in and you can kill or capture the men, right? And then, of course, these European settlers, very much like the Spanish and Portuguese and the early settlers in the Caribbean, they didn't have a lot of women. So they took the women and the children in as servants and slaves in their houses. And it was not uncommon for a settler to take in maybe 5 indigenous women to his house. Make babies. But the strategy is interesting because in a vast continent like the United States, like America at the time, if you had a war with somebody and captured them and so on, what do with those captives? You know, because if you just bring them in and try to make them work, they're gonna escape. And they're gonna run out into the woods and the landscape and they're gone, you know? But they don't go so far. They just go as far as the next group that they can say, hey, these guys are coming and they're killing us, put up resistance. So it's just a constant battle. So the strategy that these New England colonists used, both the Dutch and English, was to send these people to slavery elsewhere. And one of the places to send them where they couldn't escape and they were disoriented out of their comfort zones was to the small islands that they were trying to settle throughout the Caribbean.
It's not an Indian, Indians that I've ever heard of in the Caribbean.
Yeah, I know, this is startling.
Yeah.
It is startling because it's not, because at the same time, of course, you've had the Portuguese and the Spanish who have come and who are doing the same thing with the people of South and Central America and the indigenous people of these islands. You know, right from the time of Columbus' second voyage, he started to capture and enslave the indigenous Taínos on Hispaniola. So work in the silver mines, so find gold for them. You know? And as he went around, he found that during this whole process, one of the things I've been doing is I've been reading Columbus's journals. There's a wonderful, very expensive set of translations of all of Columbus's papers that I've been going through. It's really enlightening because the observation, not only do you see that as he goes from island to island, he's not engaging with the exact same culture. There's different levels and different belief systems, different dress. He actually sees going down the south coast of Cuba in his second voyage, where he gets down to far western Cuba, and all of a sudden, the indigenous people are wearing white cotton robes and are light skinned, and these are the people that have come over from like the Yucatan, Mayans, Aztecs, this sort of folks. So, and he goes down to Jamaica and he's surprised that this is a whole different group of people. They're very advanced, they're huge seagoing canoes. He, at one point, he talks about leaving Jamaica to head back toward Hispaniola. And he's not too sure about the reception. He's got a pretty good reception, but he kind of leaves without telling the tribal leader that he's going. They get up early and they get the fleet going, and they're way out to sea, and he's already gone below. And all of a sudden, there's this commotion on deck, and the chief and his people have caught up to his sailboats in their canoe. They've got like a 40, 50 foot long canoe with 60 guys in it, and they've overtaken the sailing vessel way out into the ocean, So there again, I mean, talk about the fact that these people, these indigenous peoples were not isolated into one island. These were seagoing people. These were people that traded and had networks of family and trade all the way from South America up to Bahamas to the Floridas, Gulf Coast, Yucatan. They knew. Also, in reading Columbus's journals, Columbus had taken on indigenous captives down island, places like Guadeloupe and so on, and had taken them on board, taken some of them back to Spain, where they could learn the language and so on, and took them back on a second voyage. And these guys are traveling across the Atlantic with them, arriving at islands in the Eastern Caribbean. They're going, oh yeah, we know that island, and we know that, and then we go this way. They knew where they were. So, and we think of these settlements as like static. oh, these people were in the Tuca Valley all this time and so on. Yeah. Oh, they're moving around. Yeah. Anyway, I kind of lost track on that. Anyway, so it's interesting when we get back to this idea of Native American enslavement. As early as the early 1600s, the Dutch and these Courlanders are trying to establish colonies along the coast of Brazil and South America, despite the Spanish and then the English are trying to keep them from doing it. And they're constantly being harried by not only the coastal people, so they kind of settle, one of the places they focus on is the islands, Trinidad. And they're constantly being harried by the Native American people from the South American coast, but they also got these group of Colonial groups that are coming down from St. Vincent to try to evict them. So you have, and they're taking the Dutch. We know by this time the Dutch had already been in Brazil, and they had taken indigenous captives and enslaved them from Brazil and brought them up to places like Tobago and Barbados. So now we have not just Taino or Carib people, we have an indigenous diaspora going on. People of all different indigenous groups now being displaced and dislodged due to European enslavement and moving. Okay? So you have people coming out of South America, Brazil, into the Caribbean. The English early on identify an island called Providence, it's called Providencia today, it's owned by Colombia. But it was one of the first focuses of an English Puritan colony in the Western Caribbean. It's off the Mosquito Coast, in the area that would be, it's like Gulf of, south of the Gulf of Honduras, or like off of Panama. So they're dealing with like mosquitoes and like what would be today the Kuna people, South Central America. They're going over and they're picking up enslaved people from there and bringing to their colony. At the same time, their fellow Puritans are capturing Pequots and other Native Americans and sending them all the way down to Providence. So again, we have this Native American diaspora going, where people are being uprooted and commingled due to enslavement in the Caribbean from totally different places. And of course, we have Africans in this mix also. One of the reasons it's so hard to identify the enslaved Indians in early colonial records is because they're all referred to as blacks. Okay? They're all considered, if you're not white Christian, you are heathen, dark, black, nigger, Negro in their records. And seldom do we really see them separated out, except when you get into see records of trade and communication between the colonies. And we know and have documentation, particularly of this large Pequot group that was sent by the Puritans down to Providencia and also a number of them to Jamaica. So this mixed group of Indians now are circulating. Spain disrupts the colony in Providencia. They break it up. The English disrupt the Dutch and Courlanders in Tobago and break it up. And when those colonies get broken up, those enslaved people that are on those colonies are redispersed yet again and apportioned out between multiple places and multiple islands. And I should also state that we have North American continental indigenous people from the mid-Atlantic and down through the Floridas being taken out into the Bahamas and Bermuda and places like that as laborers.
David, is it safe to say that they were doing that because they already understood the climate and the farming issues and everything like that, and were trying to just develop a class of people to do that work?
Yeah,
The sugar wasn't introduced at that point, was it?
No, it's really not. And it's interesting, one of the things that that broke up some of those early colonies was that one of the first, aside from general trade, and we know that the Spanish Portuguese were looking for precious metals and so on, and pearls along the South American border coast. One of the first products that people were planting was tobacco. And one of the things that was the downfall of those early colonies is that when the vast American lands started opening up and getting agriculture kicked in, it created a glut in tobacco. And the little islands couldn't compete in tobacco anymore.
It was also harder for tobacco to grow here because there were, I know, like the Lutheran Church, the records would show that if you had tariffs or fines to pay, they paid it in tobacco, which is harder to produce.
Yeah, well, the tobacco was, the original colonists, most of the original settlers, like pre-Danes coming in St. Thomas, were really more or less hiding here, using it as an entrepot, like a trading place and so on. They weren't that much engaged in agriculture except to sustain themselves and grow some tobacco, because in that early period, tobacco was a valuable crop. But as time progressed, as we get into the 1600s, the mid-1600s, there's this glut in tobacco. And it's interesting, I have some maps over at the table, we can discuss that later. It's interesting that even though we see Jürgen Iveson in his first land grants taxing everybody and levying fines in tobacco, the company never planted tobacco. Because by the time the Danes arrived here, tobacco was virtually worthless on the but I don't know if that doesn't directly speak to your statement about looking for people who had, yes, to some degree, the indigenous people would have skills in agriculture and so on. But if you look at these indigenous cultures, and it seems to be pretty much the same in the South American and North American indigenous cultures, that the men didn't do planting. They were not the agriculturists in the family. And it's really just a laboring underclass that they're going for. And it's why, there's many factors, but it's largely why the indigenous people in the Caribbean and islands like Hispaniola, that have millions of people, were gone in a generation or two, because they had never lived a life of that kind of labor, forced labor and work.
We were always taught in school that that's why the introduction of African slavery came in, because they tried that first. They had all the people that were from Europe and everything empty the prisons, but they just couldn't take the heat.
Yeah.
So it becomes the next best thing, because ultimately they just needed to produce enough to sustain here.
Yeah.
And then the introduction of sugar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and that's 100% correct. That the very first mass forced labor in the New World, in Caribbean and New England and South America, that was an attempt to utilize the indigenous people.
Yeah.
Okay. And when that petered out, but it took a while. I mean, we think of it as like happened just like that, but it really didn't. It was a century or so before the real push to bring in people from across the Atlantic kicked in full gear. And that's another thing, is that, before I get to that, I'm going to follow up on that. But in saying that it's hard to identify indigenous enslaved people, in this book, which I have, which is basically a transcription of the 1688, the first really kind of complete or more concise consensus for St. Thomas that we have, you will note that there are indigenous or Indians mentioned. Now, we don't know if they're indigenous. Some people think maybe these were Tainos that were here. I don't think so. I think that it's probably, Hoyce tells us that the Dutch, who had been expelled from places like Tobago and the British Island and British Virgin Islands, were here in the mid-1600s, and they had what he calls Caribs, but he is just seeing any indigenous person that's Carib, okay? But clearly the Dutch, they were fleeing, they'd been kicked out of Brazil and out of Tobago and Guianas. So there's a good chance they just brought people that were South American, indigenous people with them. And we know that some of these English people that were there also at that time had been routed, and they were, again, I would like to use the term Anglophone rather than English. They're English speaking, but mostly like Scottish and Irish, underclass. We know that folks had come from Nevis and St. Kitts, and St. Eustatius has been broken up by the English around that same time. And so they're bringing the enslaved people that they have with them. And in their mix, we have that mix of people that have come out from, like the English places, the Mosquito Coast, and then down from the United States, America, North America. But one of the earliest reference I have found to an indigenous enslaved person on St. Thomas comes from Jürgen Iverson's account book. And in Jürgen Iverson's account book, he lists the enslaved individuals that he purchased on behalf of the colony here between 1673 and 1679 when he left. Okay. And the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, the 8th person that he bought on behalf of the colony after his arrival is written, he bought him on September 2nd. Let's see, September 2nd, 1673, he writes in his journal that he bought an Indian man named Jan. He lists the names of every one of the people, the given names that have been given. But some of them are interesting. They're not all European names. We named them Manga, Java. So anyway, he names the individuals. And later he gives a little accounting down at the bottom of how many children these individuals produced in the time he was there, and how many died. And it's also interesting to note that the vast majority of them are women, young women. So we have absolute proof early on that we have indigenous people being purchased. And for this person to be, also in the account books, we understand that he has been buying enslaved people from Nevis, the English in Nevis. And that's definitely one of the points where we would have seen Pequots in North American Indians coming up. So there it is. Then we go to some other supporting evidence we have for the indigenous enslaved presence in the islands. Something that interested me, if you read Oldendorf, Christian Oldendorf, the Moravian missionary, that did, kept a wonderful journal of his time in the islands in the mid-1700s. There's a really enlightening chapter in there where he interviews a number of enslaved people. And so you get firsthand accounts, people talking their own words about, what tribes they're from, where they came from, how they were captive, things like this. But one of the individuals he interviews is, I don't think he quotes an interview from another historian, a contemporary historian, who has interviewed one of these indigenous individuals. And the first time I read it, I was just, it was before I knew about any of this. And I was so confused because the guy talks about his tribal creation myth, about where his people came from. And it just didn't make any sense to me. And he talks about, being captured by other tribes and being brought to like what appears to be like the Bahamas, and then how he got carried to St. Croix by another indigenous group as a slave, right? And that's the other thing. All these indigenous cultures practice slavery themselves, okay? To some degree, a form of it. But now, if you go back and read, with this information in your mind, if you go back and read that creation myth and that story of that individual, it's clear that this guy's a New England Indian. Okay? That his creation myth has nothing to do with Great Serpent or the Amazon or any of this. He's a North American man.
So mixed.
It's all mixed. So as we talk about our, I'll try to wrap this up. We spent much longer on this subject than I would have expected. But it's fascinating. So as we now think about ways we have to kind of reassess and reinterpret, rethink about our narrative, we're going to have to look much closer at the early indigenous presence in the islands, given the overwhelming length of time and the obvious impact they must have had on our landscapes and our cultures. Because these people didn't, as we know now, thanks to DNA. Again, I go back to my daughter-in-law, who had her DNA done recently, and she's all happy about the amount of Native American, indigenous Taino, and South American Indian that shows up in the DNA. This is wonderful stuff.
A question though, this museum, 7,000 years, one small building, one small room.
Yeah.
How do you think we should attack that or address
I'll give you my donut.
But to that point though, everything that has been found in the two digs,
Well,
where?
okay, freeing that stuff up. And
Okay.
using,
Yes, please. Yes.
it's there. The Sean at the Shippo, they have a lot of stuff created and all that, and finding use in the need for all the place to store all of this, to try to have a lot of this. Once again, I'm always thinking this happened in exhibits, you have a little plaque card, but Jess and Ladine are like, you have to make that interactive. And you're telling the story in light of where the world was last year and Black Lives Matter and all that, and people being sensitive to all these stories. I mean, this is a major part. You have to start with that and to show it. It also shows some of that, the pottery, the chicken dig and all that, just to know the presence is here. When I went to Grenada with the trust, the kids, the school-aged kids in Grenada, this is 15 years ago, were digging up all the Indian remains and selling the trinkets off to tourists as souvenirs. But they were major trinkets. You could buy a zenny on the street.
Oh, wow.
I mean, Sonia Slinger had like shelves full of huge big pottery bowls and all this stuff. So you can see the migration throughout the Caribbean from South America to here to our Indians. And I mean, the pieces that remain here, to be able to tell that complete story in a short space of time. And one of the things in terms of making it accessible, yes, we can have a video presentation and you can do a lot of this stuff, but people want to see and touch things and make the story come alive.
I gotta say, just the fact that we have archival documentation that really tells a story, like this page from Iverson's journal right there, that highlights showing Jan Indian. And I don't want to carry this on too much, and we should have this discussion.
Sure.
I'll cede the floor to Felipe, but I want to make one more statement about this individual right here. His life on St. Thomas is well documented. And there's some very interesting things. Perhaps just telling a story, because we have this documentation. Let me tell you a little bit about Jan. Okay, quickly. This is the first time we see him. So we know the date he's purchased. Okay. And it's interesting that in 1686, there's a census done of St. Thomas. Let's see if I get this right. 1680, there's the first listing. And in it, it lists heads of household, says that they have a wife, X number of children, and how many enslaved people in the household. It's all most of the statistics, and we only get the names of the heads of households. But at the end of the document, there is a listing of company employees, listing company employees. And Jan Indian is listed as a free servant, not free, he's servant, but he's listed as a servant. He's not in the enslaved category. And that he's working as a scout for the fort. Okay. By the time we get to the 86 census, which is our first real census of the this one here, he's not there. But he shows up on a 1686 inventory of the company plantation as a slave. And we can follow his life from that time on because he is enslaved at the company plantation sugar estate. Okay. And there are periodic inventories and slave lists for that estate all the way through the company period. And we can track Jan's life, all the way through until his death. It gives his age, and we also know that at some point he shows up as having been punished by the removal of a leg for running away. Or he had his leg cut off for running away. But he continues to show up on the enslaved list, continues to be enslaved. I have to look at it. I have his age. I think he was like, what sticks in my head is like 48 or something. Yeah. Well, pretty old for that period.
David, one of our, David, one of our members online had a question.
Sure.
That's okay, before I forget. I can figure out how to do that. Hi, how are you?
Good night. I'm Ladine. Hi, everyone there. Good afternoon. The question that I wanted to ask is, when we are looking at the indigenous people, and we have limited information, very limited actual tangible pieces of that history. Is it better to tell it in a story format, going back to your concept about imagination? Maybe we're filling in a lot of the blanks, using that imagination in a space set out that is kind of designated to imagine this life of an indigenous person, even though we don't have all the details. It's something where we have an historian that's telling this story, that we use imagery that maybe might be artist rendered. Would something like that be good to use as an option to tell the story of a indigenous person that we don't really have that much information on?
Well, I think that's what we do. That's what we do in all aspects. Even deep studied historians working from archival records, we always fill in the blanks. I mean, that's kind of the job, and the important thing is that we adhere and stick to the foundational truths that we know, and we build our narrative around those things. But I will say that particularly recently with the DNA studies and how archaeology has progressed and built over the years, I think we really have, we have this, I think we can construct as accurate a picture of the lives of the indigenous people as we can of, say, the early colonists that really left very little records or traces also. So yes, I think your idea of how to present it or presenting it is good. It's what we always do. And I will say that we have a lot of foundational material that does speak to us about that period. And as I just pointed out, in the case of an individual like Jan Indian, we've got solid documentation. We can construct the timeline of that man's life.
Just a question.
Would you help me do that?
Would I help you do that?
Yeah.
I would be glad to consult.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I've always been very much, my life is history, studying history, and really, to the largest degree possible, utilizing primary records, because I'm a primary record. And, but I also have to tell you that, particularly for the Virgin Islands, particularly for my home island of St. John, that one of the reasons I feel that I was able to connect and interpret and utilize the archival record when I kind of was Columbus going into the archives and discovering it, was the fact that I really had spent my whole life on the ground, knowing the ground, knowing the place, knowing the bays, the nooks and crannies, what's in the gut, what trees it is, what plants were used. I had a unique upbringing myself in my life. My family was split between my German mother and who went back to the United States, and my father who stayed here and ended up having a very Creole household. And the women who were mother figures to me in my life and so on were local people, and I have been informed all my life, but with my life very close to the culture and the heritage of the place, the ground itself, so that we can envision, I can imagine the things I see in the records and finding the records. I always see them in context of my place. And that's something the Danes will never do for you. As much as I deeply love my Danish friends and colleagues, and I'm so grateful for the time I've spent in Denmark and working with them, and how open their archives have been, as we start to reinterpret and rethink our archives, we need to now start thinking for ourselves. And we have to be cognizant of the fact that a lot of the foundational knowledge we think we have, the things that we have been believing, has been largely constructed upon a Danish.
I think with that, one of the things I'll suggest again, day one has always said, we have to tell those stories. We have to bring those stories alive. And to kind of bring this full circle to what we're doing with the museum is now this. I mean, what is the story that we're going to tell? And some of the things Ladine, Jess, our board have talked about was we aren't going to move out of this office and lose our presence downtown, but we want to be able to show that history, but not starting with the Danish period now, starting with the indigenous thing, having the Danes there, having the Americans talking about the importance of the dock and the narratives about GRS and Waiko. It's their dock and their things, and what people want to just, if we can put all of our culture in a small capsule, how can we best show it in those 7,000 years plus through a 20-minute jaunt through our museum and showcasing the best. So a lot of what we're discussing today, using those single items, come full circle, but then looking at all the other parts of it, not focusing on the slave period of what a Danish period, an American period. It's just a lot to cover, but to show that all the representation of a little bit of all of this throughout that time space.
I'm concerned about that transitional period between the indigenous period and the arrival of the Danes, because I think that's one of our that is the least understood period of our European colonial heritage. And I gotta point out to you guys that over by Waiko, you have one of our oldest landmarks named for early European visitation, and that's Prince Rupert. Prince Rupert's Rock Prince Rupert's visit falls well before any Danish narrative.
Don't pass it off, right?
Yeah. So that's something, again, use context is when we need to look at maps. Our maps inform us, our landscape informs us of our history. Maps always need to be centered in our interpretation. I put a number of maps out here on the table. Going back to our earliest maps, there's names we recognize, there's places that give us clues to why we call something what we call it.
Can we look at some, I mean, just in the interest of time, can we look
Sure.
at some of them?
Mulattoes, and Creoles. Right? So basically the foundational people of the settlement on St. Thomas that the white Danes are arriving and interacting with and marrying into, right, are largely mixed race Creole people. And even if you look at the early censuses, we actually see born Africans and people of African heritage, Black people, as early landowners and planters on St. Thomas.
But see, that's what you were saying. That's the part that the Danes haven't really said much about. That great matter. So now it's on us to help to share that
This is
story.
it.
Right.
Now we need to tell the story from our own perspective. And it's got to be really inclusive.
When you say Creole, what does that mean? I thought it was.
Yeah, clearly. Okay, the term is used differently in different places for different people.
Oh, okay, so there's no meaning really.
There is.
Yo-yo is
There-
a person from here.
Yes, exactly. Person from here, born
Born here,
here.
you're Creole.
Born here.
If you're born here, you're Creole.
Okay.
And this is even in the early Danish colonies, you'll see in their list of animals,
Yeah.
you'll have Creole cows and Creole horses,
Okay.
you know?
But it
The ones,
doesn't,
these were not the ones brought from Europe, these were the ones that were born here.
but it doesn't mean anything about a color.
It doesn't, except for the fact that in the early period, and in some context, the French context is significant.
Okay, yeah.
Nothing to do
And
with Creole.
And,
Right.
you know, what we're really talking about is that because of this tendency that the early Europeans, the indentures and these, you know, kind of freebooters and people who came on their own, these are men, they're not bringing their women.
No, no.
And they are for lack of a better
Yeah.
word, breeding.
Yes, yes.
This is what the Spanish called mestiz. This is the development of the mestizo people. These were the early Castellanos and so on, and mixing with the indigenous people. You get,
So it could be Indian and white, it could be black and Indian and white, it
Yes.
could be anything,
and
but
because,
they're born here.
and because the Indians were thrown together as an underclass with the black Africans at an early
Yeah.
period,
Yeah,
right?
okay.
It's not distinguished. There's already been an Indian diaspora that's got,
Okay.
you know?
Yeah, oh, yeah, that was.
And the Indian people, the indigenous Indian people, and the African people are being thrown together into one class.
That was interesting, yeah. That was a.
And the white European men are going to be intermarried
Yeah,
and
because they
breeding
didn't bring
with
any.
women.
Yes.
And there it is, right in black and white. We've got 41 women
Yes.
in 1686 in St. Thomas who are Creole to the place,
Okay,
you know?
yes.
And that's out of 77 total households.
Yes.
So, you know, more than half of the households in the colony are
It was interesting, David. Oh, we're looking at the last round. Oh. That was informative. Oh, wrong spot.
I'm so sorry.
Are you taking pictures?
Yeah, so this is the oldest known map that we have of anywhere else.
Oh,
Which
okay.
one?
Can you give me a?
This one
point
right
of
here.
reference?
I sure can.
Okay.
This is Schmittsburg, or Bluebirds Hill. This is Bluebirds Hill. Okay.
Sorry.
We talked about the path. Here's the path. Okay. This is the road going down through Estate Thomas and up the Raccoon Hill here, moving up and going down into the Tutu Valley. Okay. This is Sugar Estate. This okay, this is where the ruins, the sugar factory ruins are on the corner across from Wheatley Center and
Mrs. Milker's house.
Miss Wilkins.
What was the name of that estate? I mean, did it have other than Sugar Estate?
Estate Thomas.
Okay.
That's Estate Thomas. And that's from Estate St. Thomas. It was the company plantation.
Okay.
Okay. When the Crown took over the company's holdings,
Yeah.
Count Schimmelman was their, you know, high-level friend of the king and so on. And he purchased the company plantations from the Crown. Okay. So you'll see it over here in Oxlam's map of the same area. Okay. Here's that same plantation here, and he writes that this is Count Schimmelman's plantation. But here's that same road coming out of town, you know, here around Schmittsburg. And of course, what we call Bluebeard's Castle has been built now, but it hasn't been built yet over here in 1680. And the reason why that tower was built was that when the colony first started, all of the agricultural endeavor was close to the main fort and up around here. So this area, now this is of course quite later, this is Oxum 1780, but this area up here, hospital ground, and it still says hospital ground right there, okay?
Wow.
And it says hospital ground, I don't know if it's on this one. There's another map that's contemporary with this that identifies this all the way back in 1686 as hospital. Hospital was one of the earliest company plantations. As town grew, the agricultural sector got spread out into the new quarter. Okay, the original company plantation had been north of the fort and up into the valley by hospital ground. Okay, but as town grew and the agricultural sector expanded, the focus of agriculture became Sugar Estate and Estate Thomas. But there was no way they could monitor this area from the tower in the fort. Because the old tower that was in the fort, they could see all around. But Bluebeard's Hill, Schmitzport was in the way. They couldn't monitor what was going on here. So they built the tower at the top of the hill here to be able to monitor.
So it wasn't just exclusively for fortification for the harbor, it was also, I mean, to see what enemy ships, it was also for plantation monitoring.
Absolutely. And probably more so than even the harbor defense. Okay.
Wow.
Because
All my time I've been.
I mean,
Yeah,
Because you didn't think about it that way.
they built a small man tower up on the top of Flag Hill too.
Mhm.
Okay. So they had that, and that was constantly manned. So that was their first indication. If somebody's coming from way outside,
Yeah.
right?
You could
This
see more.
one was more really two things, okay? To be able to observe and monitor everything that was going on, because by this time, you see, these parcels of land out into Tutu Valley hadn't really been divided out yet.
Yeah.
Okay. This is the new quarter. The new quarter moved from the King's Quarter. This was pretty much the extent of the new quarter at this point.
So what were they looking for? Like if somebody was seeking more land or is, or
Monitoring, just conditions, the work rate. Remember, there's a big bay here. If somebody comes in, you know, or out, they can't see that from the fort.
Yeah.
Okay. The other thing is, and I'm sorry that I had one more map, a larger map of the harbor that's contemporary with this map. And I had it done in the States and mailed down to me, and it didn't arrive in time for this. I just, matter of fact, Red Hook Mail Service just pinged me that it arrived, but they close at noon today. So anyway, but you might be able to see it on this. This is also a very early map. This dates to about 1720. We know that this one down here, this is part of a, the reason we have that is it comes from a court case. And this fellow Nicholson was sent out to investigate the situation. There's a whole story of the court case, why that map got created. It has to do with the conviction of Esmond and Milan.
oh,
This is what happened was, this was actually a private plantation owned by an early Dutchman that was here, that was on St. Thomas before the Danes arrived. Okay. That's why it's already so developed at this period. Okay. And his name was Otto Eden, and his family was a sea captain, kind of a pirate type, you know.
yeah.
And he butted heads with Esmond because he wanted to continue. He welcomed in the Danes and wanted to work under their protection, but he expected to be able to just keep operating the way he was operating, right? And they were very jealous of him because he had a well-established plantation. He had enslaved people on the plantation, including an Indian, a slave Indian that's referred to in the records. Get this, she's referred to as a squaw, okay? In the records, squaw is not a Caribbean Indian name. It is a Cherokee, I think. Names words specifically. So the fact that she's mentioned, called a squaw, just she's North American.
Yeah.
You know? So they've got a squaw who's the nurse for the children in the household. And it's like, anyway, this guy was big cheese. He had ships, he had a warehouse in town, he had a slave labor force, and he already had a sugar factory up and running. Shows where the sugar factory is here and talks about it. So he didn't want to cooperate with Esmond. Esmond has him arrested, hauled into the fort, hangs him, cuts off his head, nails his head to a stake and puts it on display in front of the fort. Okay? His cohort was
Terrible.
I think Lucas or Shockham Delicat, one of the Delicats, okay? These guys were the early Dutch guys that really ruled this place, you know, and those families continued to rule the place right up through 1755. Matter of fact, it's their constant resistance against the Danish company and the Dutch wealth. It's why they busted all the Dutch, took in the Dutch loans, and basically De Wint's from Beaverhood, Stella Katz, all those guys just took them over. But Otto Eden would not cooperate. Esmond took his ship, his warehouse in town, and his plantation for himself. Then when he was disgraced and the Danes sent Milan as the governor to replace him, Milan looked at this property and said, hey, that's too good a property.
And he took it too.
And he took it. And that's what blew the whistle on Milan. They sent out this group from Denmark, this commission, to investigate the situation. And they arrested both Esmond and Milan and hauled them back to Denmark. And this map was drawn by Nicholson's commission to document where the plantation was.
It's a good West Indian saying, a thief from a thief made God laugh.
Yeah, yeah. And then, of course,
And now the four, he's in
and of course,
Cortola.
Milan gets executed back in Denmark. He loses his head in
I know.
Copenhagen. But they send Esmond back. Right? But the problem was, and this went all the way to High Chancery, and this court case did not get settled until well into Governor Lorentz and so on, much later into the 1700s. The problem was that Otto Eden had 3 sons who legally was heirs,
Of course.
and a daughter
And they wanted
who married a Danish settler, okay? And they wanted the land back.
Of course.
And they didn't know what to do with her. So they relegated her to this small portion of her original plantation, where basically she lived more or less impoverished
Oh, yeah.
with her kids. And this map was all because of her court case about demanding to get the land back.
One other thing though, you had mentioned earlier about the names of areas like Northside Bay.
Right.
You're looking at some of them. Just shed a little light for our thing, because I'm seeing Crum Bay,
Yeah.
that's still called Crum Bay.
Sure, talk about names. The reason I put this out, this is
Fortuna.
this is
Isn't that a
Olden.
German map?
This
It
is,
says in
yes,
German?
this is Oldendorf. This is the Moravian map.
Yeah.
Okay. 1767. And the reason I have this out here is I'm looking at it upside down.
You want to turn it quickly?
For the Bethel?
Bethel. With Bethel, there's Bethel right there.
New Hern Hut next to it too.
Yep. Well, Bethel and New Herrenhead.
Yeah.
Those were the 2 plantations owned
The
by the
Murray,
Moravians. Okay.
Schimmelman is one.
And that this is the only map or indication that we have confirming, I mean, we have documentation now, but this is the only map of St. Thomas that we have that shows the location of the Bethel plantation.
It also says Tapoose too, which is funny
Yep.
for the town.
Yep. So, yeah, so names and context are so important. And I think that if we look, this one's wonderful too, because it's got an inset of the area by the fort. You can see the old road system.
What year is this?
This is about someplace between 1720 and 1730. Okay.
Do you have, does it give you any information about what these structures are up here?
Well, it actually has the names of whose houses they are. Which are here. There's the names on them, and then we have a key up here relating to the letters. Okay.
Okay, I saw it.
I'll have to look at one.
So here I talk about how, here's the fort, and I talk about how the early plantations were just in the fort. So here we see Governor Frederick Mott's plantation, which of course is what we know now this area is hospital ground, okay?
Oh.
Here's the old goal. Right here, look at this, Prince Rupert's Rock.
That's it.
Oh, yeah.
There you go. So
Right.
already in
Bavarian,
already in
Bavarian.
1720, you know, we are we are using the name of Prince Rupert,
Still, yeah.
you know, who had predated the Danes. So that name carries that landmark. And it's interesting also out on Water Island, we have Albert de Ruyter's plantation. And de Ruyter, of course, was a Dutchman who was famous for harrying the English throughout the Caribbean. And he had put his land base there on Water Island way predates Danish presence and Danish occupation. So, you know, de Ruyter would be one of these individuals that was here. And it's funny because, you know, in that Danish narrative, you're always going to read that when Iverson came and, you know, took St. Thomas in the name of the Danish crown, that it was abandoned, that there was nobody here.
Oh, yeah,
Well, obviously, nothing could be further from the truth.
yeah.
And we have to realize that that was just, that's a published statement of expediency. If he was to admit that there was somebody else there, then they would have come,
Sure.
okay? And the people that were there, these Dutch, Anglophone, French, mixed, disenfranchised people that, you know, were more or less freebooters and on their own, they were welcoming the Danes to come in because they needed the protection. They were constantly being carried by the other countries that were trying to gain dominance in the area at the time. So Iverson was lying, but he was lying, you know, to support his legal claim to be able to take possession.
Take over.
This is a wonderful document too. There was a Danish economist. His name is Christian Marfeld. You know that Christian Marfeld? Marfeld was sent out. He was a Dane. He was sent out in 1763. He stayed from 1763 to 1768 in the colony. And during that time, he wrote everything down. He interviewed everybody.
Oh.
He made maps. He made tables. Wrote narratives. And he's got like 3 or 4. I think there's 4 journals about that day. Danish archives of Marfeld's journals. And he did wonderful little things. Like he wrote pages and pages, and this is just a translation, description of all the keys around St. Thomas.
Oh.
Why they're named, what they're named, whose plantations are there, and so on. And he did it for all the others. Not only did he do the keys, he did the bays too. You know?
Wow.
This one is the base of St. Thomas that I brought. I brought it kind of to look at with the maps. And you can see where he starts, and some of the names are kind of incomprehensible. Remember, he's a Dane now too, and he is, yeah, we have the difficulties of communication even between the local individuals. There's so many languages and tongues being spoken here, you know.
Oh, yeah.
And Danish, as you know, is a difficult language. You know? So eventually they kind of settled on Creole Dutch, you know, locally. And then after the British occupations, the language of trade and commerce morphed into English. And you see English after about 1812 or so.
David, somebody asked if you could repeat the name of that document that has the.
Yeah, this is Christian Marfeld, Martfeldt. And he also did genealogies. He has tables where he interviewed every inhabitant on St. Thomas and wrote down so-and-so from Aarhus, you know, his wife, so-and-so from Nevis, and then gives her family names, right? And his family names, like genealogy charts for the whole colony.
Wow.
You know? And he Does it for St. Thomas, St. John?
But what was the population approximately at that time? That he can interview everyone.
Well, you know that he's not really interviewing everyone.
I
He's
know, yeah.
interesting. He's
The
interviewing,
class, yeah.
yeah, the gentry class,
Mhm.
okay, and the government class. But I mean, those are the foundational people, the landowners.
Mhm.
Basically, that's what it breaks down. If you own land, own property, you're part of that class. Gosh, I don't know. It goes on for pages, pages, pages. And he also separates them into claimed nationalities. So he'll have this French, then he lists all the surnames that are of French derivation, Dutch,
Wow.
and Swedes, Irish, English. He does it to everybody.
One last thing about the map you can see as they get to Hornbeck, how the island is taking shape as we know it.
Mhm.
And how some basic things that make its way, it's so pronounced in all of the maps.
Yeah, this map here that we normally refer to as the Van Kulen map, that was actually originally drawn by a Brandenburger by the name of names. I'll pull it. No, that's dedicated to Governor Bedell, the map. I'll think of his name. But Van Kulen was the publisher. It's not the guy actually. Okay. But we call it the Van Kulen map. It's a wonderful map. It's our first really concise map. And the beauty of it is that it was published and the map was made right at the year that the Danes first reached out and started to settle St. John. So it's the first map we have that shows any part of St. John. And it has this inset of Coral Bay. So it makes it very important. Yes, this guy's name was de Bonmaison. What's his name?
It was French? That's hard. Let you remember. Wow. Good for you.
But yeah, he came and he was working with the Brandenburgers and he stayed with the Brandenburgers for quite a while. The Brandenburgers are another one of those, and this is the other thing that makes these early periods so hard, is that we're talking about, I refer to it as they're operating in a jigsaw puzzle world, okay? Because even countries haven't been fully formed yet,
Okay.
England in this period was only England. It wasn't Great Britain,
No. Yeah.
I mean, we don't have, at this time, those Irish and Scottish that are very prominent in these early people. They're not English.
Yes.
They're Irish and Scottish,
Absolutely.
And it's like we have these duchies, like the Brandenburgers, and then, like the Kurlanders, of Western Europe. And it's a mess. One of the reasons why Spain was the first one over here is those countries of the Iberian Peninsula had finally driven out the Moors and kind of got some dominance in the Iberian Peninsula there, and were starting to build the unified, houses of Castile and Leon, and they all of a sudden were wealth and could afford to finance and push out things. So Spain had already taken its shape, but places like England hadn't even really taken, hadn't become, and the same thing with the Dutch. There's no one Dutch at this time. It's all little Dutch states before the Netherlands. And even Denmark, we have the Kingdom of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden.
Yes.
But in parts of this early period, Denmark was at war with Sweden, and Sweden got hooked up with the Courlanders, to help go over and establish colony in Tobago. So just even figuring out the alliances and who people are
Yes.
is really hard. I'm sorry, I keep going. We
Oh,
gotta
that's
stop.
okay. It's been such an interesting.
It
It really is.
Senior, like everybody tells you, senior.
Yeah, promise.
These maps are fascinating, but tell our audience how people can find some of your books.
Okay, as far as published books,
Yeah,
what's Sophia's name? VI now.
no,
Yeah,
okay.
now.
And online, they have a store, and they have my books there. Bajo El Sol Gallery. You can contact them also. They don't have an online presence, but you can call them or contact them through email. You can find they're at Mongoose Junction. And myself personally, I'm a historian. I'm not a businessman. I don't push my product. Somebody wants a book, ask somebody, find
We'll
something.
track you down.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
for
Really
that.
glad you-
Thanks very much.
Thank you for everyone that tuned in,
Oh, yeah.
and we hope to see you in the museum, at our new facility.
Coming online
Please
soon.
volunteer,
Congratulations.
renew your membership. Hopefully, moving forward in the new year, we'll have some new and exciting program in addition to the new White Coat Center. All right, thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I took some nice pictures of all of you.
Well,